Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to be talking about trade, in particular the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if you don't know what that is, that's exactly why we're doing the program, and especially to alert you to some of the concerns that we have. As I mentioned yesterday, when we get close to the conventions, both the Republican convention next week, the Democratic convention next week, after that, it's just going to be difficult to cover some of these very important issues, and we're going to do so. Let me just mention, too, that we do have an action alert for you. We announced it yesterday and really encourage you to take up on this particular issue, because we know that there will be a vote tomorrow in the House of Representatives on the Conscious Protection Act. And that vote will be taking place on Wednesday, and this is why we encourage you to let your elected representative know your concerns. We've talked about some of the issues, whether or not this would force pro-life healthcare workers to participate in abortions, whether right now, as we're seeing even in the state of California and other places where health plans are supposed to cover abortion and various abortive type of drugs, even if they're churches and Christian organizations. So we're going to certainly talk more about that a little bit later, but that's the action item for you today. And after we have a little bit of a conversation about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think you'll see there'll be some other action items as well. I'm welcoming to the microphone Curtis Ellis. He is the Executive Director of the American Jobs Alliance. He's also a columnist for WorldNet Daily. We've posted one of his columns from The Hill and one from WorldNet Daily on this very topic. He, in the past, was a writer and producer for Lou Dobbs Tonight and has had his work appear on everything from 60 Minutes to the Associated Press, NBC News, and much more. And Curtis, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Kirby.
You know, for some of our listeners, they hear Trans-Pacific Partnership. Maybe even they heard some of it during the Republican debates, and it's real easy for your eyes to kind of glaze over and say, well, that's this esoteric stuff, and it's all about trade, and I don't know how it affects me. So for a few minutes, help us understand why this is so important, because I think this is an issue that hasn't been well covered by even talk radio, but especially hasn't been covered well by the mainstream press.
No, it certainly hasn't, Kirby, and you do bring up a very good point. I personally believe it's been constructed and framed so as people don't pay attention. There's a cover-up, and as you say, people hear trade, they think, well, trade's good, I like trade, and it gets a bit esoteric, and I'm not going to really pay much attention to this. But that's why, number one, I've been calling it Obama trade. It's like Obamacare. This is a multi-thousand-page agreement that Congress is going to have to pass it to find out what's in it. But let's get to the specifics here. This is really not about trade. This is an international regulatory agreement. It sets up an international regulatory agency, much like the EPA or the FDA or any one of those alphabet soup agencies that we have in Washington, handing down edicts that we're all supposed to comply with. Whether we're a city government, a village government, you know, we now have to have certain bathrooms, or a state government that we're not going to be getting our tax dollars back from Washington unless we comply with the rulings of these bureaucrats. The difference here is that this is now an international regulatory commission that will have foreign unelected bureaucrats writing regulations that affect not just international trade, but affect the commerce within our own country as well. These regulations will touch on the food we eat, the energy we use, how we use it, how it's generated, whether we can use coal or oil or gas or if we have to do renewables, energy, wind energy. It affects copyrights and patents, which again sounds like one of those esoteric issues. Like, what does that mean to me? Well, what it means is you end up paying more for a product or some goods if their innovation is being stifled, and new companies are not allowed to emerge because the inventive imagination of our people is being locked up and held down by these exclusive rights to the existing companies. And it also affects the drugs, pharmaceutical drugs. It could lead to higher drug prices for retired folks and for everybody. And it would affect what we see on the Internet. There's some very, very dangerous rules here within this Trans-Pacific Partnership that affect what we see on the Internet and the power of large global corporations to pull stuff off of the Internet merely by the threat of saying, we're going to sue your Internet provider for copyright infringement unless they take down a website.
Wow.
So, yeah, and how did I leave this one out, Kirby? This Trans-Pacific Partnership creates rules, and it has written right into it, rules that these international bureaucrats would write that affect immigration. Who crosses our borders? Who is allowed to come into our country to work at jobs that maybe your teenage son or daughter works at? There is a chapter in this Trans-Pacific Partnership that is known as the Trade in Services chapter. Trade in Services. Sounds like, you want to talk mind-numbing? There you go. Trade in Services. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what it means. It means that person cutting the grass, that let's say there's a Mexican doing landscape work or digging a ditch in the main street of your town. That is not a Mexican anymore. That is a national engaged in the trade in services. They're performing landscaping services or construction services. Now, according to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Congress is not allowed to place any limits whatsoever on the number of people who can cross the border to engage in the trade in services. Translating that into plain language, it means Congress will be forbidden from limiting the number of foreign workers that can come into this country to work in any number of fields. And these are jobs that Americans can do, will do, have done in the past, and could do in the future. But if, let's say, one of the member countries, one of them happens to be Mexico, if a Mexican company wants to bring truck drivers into America to engage in transportation services and provide transportation services to Walmart, the United States Congress would not be able to say, well, first you have to hire American drivers before you can hire Mexican truck drivers. That would be forbidden under the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Incredible. We need to take a break, and when we come back, by the way, I might just mention, the second hour we're going to talk about refugees, because that's a new book out, so that will connect up to this. But I've oftentimes, in order to get people's attention, say that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even if you don't know what it is, if you thought it was a good idea for the UK to actually get out of the EU, in other words, was it good for Great Britain to no longer have a transnational entity dictating what kind of laws, then maybe you've got some real concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if you've ever in the past had any concerns about NAFTA or GATT or the World Trade Organization, well, then you're going to have some other concerns as well. And when we come back, we're going to answer the really important question, because some of you right now are saying, why aren't I hearing more about this? Well, I think there's a reason for it, and we're going to get into that and have posted a couple of articles for you to read today. One from The Hill, the other from WorldNet Daily. They're both written by Curtis Ellis, our guest. We'll continue our conversation with him and then with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Globalization has benefited most everyone on this planet except for the middle class and especially people in the working class. A chart posted by Timothy Carney shows how the global population has fared economically over the last 20 years. I've included the graph with the transcript of this commentary so you can see it for yourself. On the far left are the poorest of the poor who are still as poor as they were. But almost everyone else is doing better economically. This includes the global lower middle class all the way up to the global upper class. But the chart dips down dramatically for one segment that can be identified as the middle class and the working class in wealthy countries like the United States. In the past, the working class and middle class benefited from being born in America. They had access to resources and materials and could exchange in a free market. They also were shielded from competition and industries using workers with lower wages. Globalization opened America's working class to competition from other parts of the global workforce. This chart has appeared in other articles and has often been referred to as the globalization elephant chart. In other words, globalization is often the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. Now, to be fair, many politicians have talked about the fact that the wages of the middle class have declined. Some have suggested trade barriers and all sorts of political and economic solutions. The problem in finding solutions can be seen in the graph that shows how well the wealthy have done. The political and economic elite have benefited greatly from open borders, free trade, and globalization. How motivated do you think they will be to make economic changes that might benefit the working class when it might have a negative impact on their earning potential? When elites in this country and other wealthy countries are getting richer from globalization, I think they won't be very motivated to help the working class. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven, How Do We Explain the Impossible? Available now, Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD, rated PG. miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking today about globalism, globalization, and even supranational entities that want to rule your life. And I might just mention that even though I tape my commentaries a week ahead of time, the one that landed today, Global Middle Class, talks a little bit more about globalization and some of those issues. Our guest is Curtis Ellis, and if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. And Curtis, the question is certainly on the minds of some individuals is even as you went through this, they're thinking, well, this should be like front page news, and this should be something that a lot of people are covering. And there probably are debates in Congress about this, but I get the sense that most of that has been pushed aside, and a lot of this will take place after the election. Am I right?
You're exactly right. The reason we're not hearing it on a lot of the corporate media is because the corporate media depends on advertising dollars from the very corporations that are pushing this deal. As you said before the break, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is very much like NAFTA, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it has very much in common with the European Union. Both the European Union and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are based on the idea of the free flow of people, goods, and money across borders. So it would erase the national borders around the U.S. and merge our economy with some of the most oppressive and poorest nations on earth, countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, a communist dictatorship, Brunei, which is ruled by Sharia law, Malaysia, which is a Muslim-majority country that puts people in concentration camps to convert them to Islam, and is notorious for slave trading. The electronics factories and the palm oil plantations in Malaysia are staffed almost entirely by slaves. So the slavery is alive and well in this world, and it will be part of the American economy even more under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, as you said, will very likely come up for a vote after the election in what's known as a lame duck session of Congress. After we vote out our congressmen, the ones we reject and send home are brought back to Washington for one last chance where they can cast their vote or trade their vote for their next employer on K Street in the lobbying field, and that's when the Trans-Pacific Partnership will come up for a vote. I'm not making this up. This is what Mitch McConnell has said. This is what Paul Ryan has referred to. This is what President Obama himself has said. His people have said, we are preparing for a vote after the election. And just today, I wrote this up for WorldNet Daily. It'll be going up very shortly, the story. Hillary Clinton's top advisor told the Australians that this Trans-Pacific Partnership will be approved by Congress in a lame duck session of Congress later this year. He was saying that while Hillary is out there saying she opposes the deal.
Yes. Yeah. And that you bring me to the next point, and that is, first of all, you have some people say, I believe in free trade, and I've got some concerns about this, but then when it comes time to vote, it turns out that's a little bit different. But help us out, Curtis, because sometimes there's a very definite partisan split between Republicans and Democrats. This is not one of those, because you can find some very prominent Republicans that are for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As a matter of fact, those that are tied to corporate dollars. You can certainly find some Democrats that can. At the same time, you find some Democrats that are concerned about what this would do to labor unions, what this would do to workers, and you find some Republicans that are concerned about what this does to sovereignty. So this one doesn't easily split along party lines, does it?
No, it doesn't. This is really shuffles the deck. Donald Trump is adamantly opposed to this. Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama, has been a staunch opponent of this. Last year we had a big fight in Congress to grease the skids for this agreement. It was the fast-track fight, special rules that allow this deal to be approved by a simple majority and cripples Congress's ability to amend the agreement. It strips Congress of its ability to amend the agreement. That passed by one vote in the House and just a couple of votes in the Senate. Senator Jeff Sessions led the fight against those fast-track rules. He's been sounding the alarm and fighting against this ever since. And there are, as you say, there are some corporatist Republicans and corporatist Democrats. I mean, look, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell led the fight for that fast-track fight, to give the president this fast-track power and to strip Congress of its ability to amend whatever agreement Obama negotiated. So Mr. Ryan and Mr. McConnell were for it. Now they're claiming, well, we don't want to bring it up for a vote before the election because it'll look like Custer's last stand for our members if they're forced to vote on this thing. So let's do it after the election when nobody's paying attention. Yeah, it has scrambled all the party definitions. I think, Kirby, I think what it points up is that in this day and age now, the division in our country is not between the old definitions of liberal and conservative so much, though on some issues those remain. It's between the elite, the power elite, and the rest of us. And it's between the nationalists, the people who believe, the patriots and the globalists, the people who still believe in America, and let's do what's good for Americans, and the people who say, well, let's do what's good for the global economy. And if it's good for the global economy to hire slave wage labor in Malaysia so that Apple computers can have a hard drive made by slaves in Malaysia, that's good for the global economy, that's fine with me. Or there's 10 other examples that would come to mind. But it's about doing what's good for Americans or doing what's good for a global elite. It's about the insiders versus the rest of us. And people are starting to get the picture that the donors, the same people are funding both political parties. And the people at the top of the pyramid, whether they call themselves Democrats or Republicans, are really working for the same interests, and it's not theirs. Not ours.
You know, in this last election, I sense that people had, maybe they don't know a thing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but they do have a sense that there are certain individuals that want to shake up the establishment and aren't going along with some of these ideas. And on the Republican side, you saw that with Donald Trump, who even talked about the false song of globalism. But even on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders, I mean, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders probably disagree on everything, but not everything, because on a few things they agree, and that is these outside influences are not helpful. And so you can see sometimes there are people that are, even if they don't know what the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership are, they're still concerned about the fact that we're losing our sovereignty and we're doing great harm to our workers here in America.
Yeah, we certainly are. And that's what Jeff Sessions pointed out. We are losing our sovereignty. This agreement is a nascent European Union. The very point that the Brits want out of the European Union, Obama and Hillary want to get us into a Pacific Union. This top Hillary advisor who told the Australians that we're going to pass TPP later this year, don't worry about it, folks. He is the man who created the pivot to Asia. He worked under Hillary in the State Department. They're saying he could be Secretary of State if she wins in November. And this, let me back up for 1 second now. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it's written, right now involves 12 countries in South America and Asia, and it includes Australia as well. So we've got, like I said, countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Japan, but the unique, as well as Mexico and Canada, but the unique thing about this Trans-Pacific Partnership is, and it says right in it, it's a living agreement.
Yes.
It can grow.
I wanted to get back to that. We have to take a break. Let me come back to that because that's a really important point. That was one of my next points about what can the Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission do, and the fact that, of course, we have a so-called living constitution now that all of us disagree with, but this is actually defined as a living document and a living agreement. So let's take a break. And by the way, as we go to the break, let me just mention that we would certainly open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But please go to the website. You're going to find a couple of good articles by Curtis Ellis, one from The Hill, Obama and the True Nature of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one from WorldNet Daily, TPP means executive overreach on a global scale, and then when his comes out this afternoon, we'll post that one as well. But as you go there, don't forget that our action item for you today, and it was one that we talked about yesterday, is to let your representative know how you feel about the Conscience Protection Act. A vote will be taking place tomorrow. And this is a concern because some have said, you know, the rate this is going, pro-life health care workers might be forced to participate in abortions. Those of you listeners in the state of California have already seen how it's mandated that employee health care plans cover abortions, even when those policies are provided for churches and religious organizations. And, of course, we talked the other day about the decision of the Supreme Court to not hear the case of the Christian-owned pharmacy that is required now to dispense abortion-producing drugs. So again, go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the action alert. We've given you an opportunity to contact your member of Congress, and we'll be right back.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as district health director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dice of First Liberty is representing Dr. Walsh in his effort to correct this apparent injustice. And Jeremy Dice became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking the truth in love. Click on Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit. Please do it today. Pointofview.net. or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'd love to get your comments. What are your thoughts? Should we actually enter into an agreement that looks a lot like the European Union? Matter of fact, there are other countries that want to join as well. Philippines, Taiwan, maybe even China. And again, then we would have something that looks like a kind of a multinational, transnational organization determining our future. What are your thoughts? 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have thoughts in the past about things like NAFTA and GATT, World Trade Organization. And Curtis Ellis is with us as we talk about some of the articles he's posted here. And I guess the next obvious comment and question has to do with this idea of a living agreement. And that is, there is no way, once you have established this sort of transnational, supranational entity, that Congress can modify it, but those bureaucrats can modify it. So help us understand a little bit about what this Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission would do and how it would affect our daily lives.
Well, this living agreement aspect of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is probably the scariest thing about it. It sets up this international commission, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission, that would have the power to modify and update the agreement. And it sets out very specific rules about how this commission gets to modify and update the agreement. It says that the commission will issue the rulings, and unless there is a specific objection within 5 days, an objection to the decision made by this commission must be registered in writing within 5 days. Otherwise, the decision is considered final. Now, Kirby, you and I know that Congress can't even find its way to the water fountain in 5 days. So that basically just writes Congress out of the picture. This commission is going to be updating this agreement, including getting to decide who joins the agreement. So, as you said, Indonesia, Thailand, Taiwan, they're all in line. They've all said they want to join. In fact, the Obama administration has said China has made overtures about joining, and we know that ever since Richard Nixon, we've had a one China policy. We officially recognize only one China. So that means if Taiwan wants to join, you can bet Beijing's going to be knocking at the door saying, me too, because there's only one China and Taiwan's part of it. So it doesn't take a gypsy fortune teller with a crystal ball to figure out where this thing's going. So now you've got a Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission where the Sultan of Brunei, the Islamic Sultanate of Brunei, has the same voice and the same vote as the President of the United States, and he's going to gang up with his cohorts in Malaysia and Vietnam and elsewhere, and they're going to get to outvote the United States on updating this agreement. It says the agreement will be regularly updated and modified to take into account new situations, new issues. So we are now, as I said at the beginning, we're looking at an international regulatory body going in the same direction as when the states gave up power to Washington, and Washington bureaucrats started writing rules that the states had to live by. Now we're going to have an international bureaucracy that's going to be writing rules that the United States and every other partner in this partnership have to abide by. That's exactly what happened with the European Union. It started out in the 1950s. It was called the Common Market, and it was sold as a trade agreement. It's so the Mercedes-Benzes in Germany could be sold in Britain, and the Jaguars and Rolls-Royces in Britain could be sold in Germany, and the Fiats from Italy could be sold across borders as easily as the Volkswagens, right? Very simple, very innocuous, very plain vanilla, nothing to see here, folks. Don't pay any attention. But written into the fine print in the founding documents of the Common Market, it said, our goal is the eventual free movement of people, goods, and money across all the borders. And so over time, over the decades, what began as a common market for selling coal, steel, and automobiles morphed into this supranational state where you had an entire bureaucracy based in Brussels writing the regulations on what's a banana, what kind of cheese can be sold, what's the movement of people among countries, and even how many migrants and refugees from the Middle East do each member country have to accept into their country. And that's when the British said, enough already. We want out. We've got the oldest parliament in the world. We decide who makes the rules here. We're not going to let somebody else do that for us.
Amazing. So again, the UK, or the Great Britain, England, is leaving the UK, or the EU, I should say, and at the same time, the United States is about ready to join the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And again, let's just help people understand that we are talking about bureaucrats that would be part of this commission that are unelected. They're faceless, essentially. We don't even know who some of them are, but they would be writing rules on food and on energy and on medicine, on immigration and refugees, on copyrights, patents. This is really, in a sense, NAFTA or GATT on steroids, isn't it?
Well, if you don't think steroids are a good thing, yeah. Maybe some listeners are having to like steroids. I don't want to get in that fight. But,
no, but you know, it's much more. You know, if we were concerned about NAFTA, we should be even more concerned about this, don't you think?
Absolutely. This is Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030 with teeth.
Yes.
With teeth. Because these are enforceable rules we're talking about now. It's setting up a commission that's going to write the very specific rules, and if we don't comply with those rules, we will be punished. Our local governments, our state governments will be punished as well as the national government, and this is not conspiracy theory stuff, folks. It's happened already. We saw it just last year in Congress under the World Trade Organization, the WTO. We passed a law in this country back in 2007 that said the hamburger meat being sold in supermarkets must carry a label on it that says what country did it originate in. Yeah. Where was this made? Is that hamburger meat, is that ground beef I'm going to feed to my kids, did it come from an American farm, an American ranch, or did it come from Mexico or someplace else? Well, the Mexicans said, you know, this is an unfair restraint of trade. Americans might not want to buy Mexican beef. So we're being hurt by this law, by this labeling law. What was their solution? Not make Mexican beef better so people want to buy it. No. Their solution was, let's go to the World Trade Organization and have that law overturned. And so, under the World Trade Organization, there was a special tribunal, again, of unelected, unaccountable judges. Just so happens the judge was Mexican in this case. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
And how do you think the judge ruled?
Yeah. 3 guesses, the first 2 don't count. We already figured that one out. Let me take some phone calls along the way, because I do want to give some people a chance to join in with their comments, their outrage, their questions, whatever it might be. Deanna in Texas, you're on with Curtis Ellis.
You know?
Go ahead.
And I just wanted to say hi to you guys from El Paso, Texas.
God bless.
My comment is that we should not be joining any kind of Pacific Union or anything similar to the European Union. You know, we need to concentrate on ourselves, on the United States, and clean our own house, because we literally become the dumping ground for the whole world. We're taking on everybody else's problems and not fixing our own, and we have a lot. We live in a time and a nation where who's going to use the restroom is more important than how are we going to take care of our veterans and our soldiers and the PTSD and the Social Security system.
Well said.
So why would joining Pacific Union, where people are going to have more foreign countries, are going to have more hands in what we do in our own country? That doesn't make any sense, and so I hope that we stand together and do whatever we need to do to not join anything that has no interest other than financial in what we're doing. And it's just going to make us a poorer nation, and we're going to lose our freedom.
Sure. Deanna, I've got to come to a break, and when we come back, I'd love, Curtis, for you to talk about what we can do, because we have, as you probably figured out already, since we have these action alerts, some things that can be done, and obviously one, which we'll talk about when we come back from the break, is to find out, first of all, where your member of Congress stands on this issue. Some of you are in situations where you are going to be electing or defeating a member of Congress, 34 different U.S. Senate races. Of course, we have a presidential race, and then, of course, all of you live in a place where you have a member of the House House of Representatives up for election or re-election, and some of those are open seats. So I think it's really important to find out where they stand. But we'll talk about a couple of other things that you can do as we talk about this Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if this is the first you've heard about it, that's why we're doing the program. And we have 2 articles written by Curtis Ellis that you can read, and I would encourage you to read them. Photocopy them, pass them on to your friends, use the share button, send it on to others, get the conversation going. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes today as we have Curtis Ellis with us, educating you a little bit on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And for those of you that have been listening to Point of View for many decades, you can remember times when Marlon Maddox, as well as myself and Penna Dexter and others, talked about things like NAFTA and GATT and World Trade Organization. This is the latest, and it's one that I think may be the worst and of great concern. And you might say, well, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton. She's against it. Well, as I think you just found it out, no, probably not, and actually might be thrilled that Congress, after the election, but before she takes office, actually would be able to implement this. And some of you out there are saying, well, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, and he's actually warned against the false song of globalism. Yeah, but if this happens before his watch, what can Congress do? What can even the president do with these kinds of regulations and these kinds of agreements? So it's something to pay attention to. But Curtis Ellis, we just, of course, heard from Deanna, and she represents probably 1 million people out there or more that are saying, well, what can we do? We should take care of our own. We don't need to enter into this agreement. Can you give us some action items?
Certainly, and Deanna is a perfect case because Deanna, who lives in El Paso, has a representative a congressman, a representative in the House of Representatives, a congressman named Beto O'Rourke. And Beto O'Rourke needs to hear from Deanna and everyone else in that district. Beto voted to give Obama fast-track power. He's one of the few who actually he cast the deciding vote, because fast-track the decision to fast-track the Trans-Pacific Partnership passed by one vote. So you could, in the House of Representatives, so you could say that Beto O'Rourke cast that vote. Mm-hmm. He needs to hear from Deanna and everybody else. And everybody needs to contact their members of Congress and let them know that we oppose this. We, the people of the United States, oppose this. We do not want this to be voted on in the lame duck. If it comes up in a lame duck session of Congress or any other time, we expect them to vote no. Now, you have a very good system for people to help people find their members of Congress. I just want to say that we also have that on the website obamatrade.com.
Okay.
And in the right-hand column, there's a button that says Tell Congress. If you click that, you put in your name, your address, and it'll tell you who your member of Congress is, and you can send them an email right away. I'm sure you have action items, too, and action alerts. And it's so important that we be in touch regularly with our members of Congress. Call them, visit them. They're going to be back at the end of the week. They all go home until September. So they're going to be back in the district. If you want to set up an appointment to meet with them, FaceTime is always a very impressive way to make your point in person.
I would say so.
Yeah.
And let me just mention that I was aware of, even last night, there were some town hall meetings that some members of Congress in Texas have, because I heard some stories about them. So some have even come home early. And this is, I think, a great opportunity to catch some of them before they head off to the Republican convention, or to catch them when they come back from the Republican convention. Of course, if you have a Democratic member of Congress, then the same thing. 2 weeks from today, of course, they'll be involved in the Democratic convention. So catch them before or after, and that is important. And in terms of talking points, one of the things that you mentioned in passing I thought was a good talking point, and that is the European Union started out as nothing more than an attempt to sort of regulate European coal and steel, but it actually had in it a requirement that eventually it was going to regulate people, goods, and money. Well, interestingly enough, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is also about actually regulating people, goods, and money. So for anybody that is maybe excited that Europe, let's put it this way, that England left the European Union, then they could also make the same case that just as we are seeing how they declared their independence, we need to maintain our independence and not get tied into something that looks a lot like the European Union.
Absolutely. And when you talk to your member of Congress, some of these guys are in favor of this, because they're being told by their major donors, by the big Wall Street banks and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce types. And let me make a distinction. Your local Chamber of Commerce, those are good people. But you got this national organization down in Washington called the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, really should be called the Globalist Chamber of Commerce, for the Fortune 50 companies that are American in name only. And those people are meeting with your member of Congress virtually every day, telling them how great a deal this is. So when you meet with your member of Congress, you might get some pushback saying, "Oh, that's just silly stuff. It is not a threat to our sovereignty. No, that'd never happen." Or better yet, if you bring up immigration and you're concerned about the free movement, the free flow of people across borders, and this, how we can't put any limits on the number of workers coming in, they're going to tell you, because Paul Ryan has said this, "Oh, that's just an urban legend. This does not affect immigration whatsoever. Has no effect on immigration." Well, you see, this is lawyer language they're using. Because I'll tell you what, these worker visas that they're using right now to replace the Disney workers with people from India and elsewhere, those are considered non-immigrant visas. If you come over on a work visa, if you come over to work in the IT department at Toys R Us, or you're brought in to work on anything, those worker visas are considered non-immigrant visas. And so we bring in hundreds of thousands of these people every year. Those are non-immigrant visas. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership would remove any numerical limits whatsoever on the number of work visas that would be issued. And so, technically speaking, lawyerly, in lawyer language, oh, this is not about immigration. This is not about immigration. But for people like you and me and regular people, you talk about bringing people in from other countries, I call that immigration, right?
I would certainly say so. And again, this is because you would have this Trans-Pacific Partnership Commission, and it would try to implement the various rules related to food and energy and medicine and the internet, but also rules on immigration. And so it, even if you are convinced that they wouldn't do anything right now that would hurt us, the bottom line is sooner rather than later, that is going to modify because, as you pointed out just a minute ago, we're talking about a living agreement. So that can change and be updated continuously. And the only way you could prevent that is, as you pointed out just a minute ago, with that 5-day window, but that's not going to work very well. But let me take a quick phone call just before we run out of time. Eric in Missouri, I think you had a question for us.
That's correct. You know, y'all, as we all know, that any time that there's something proposed like this, there has to be someone who stands to benefit from it. There has to be someone who stands to make money off of it. I was raised up with the adage, one, the Word of God says that the love of money is the root of all evil. But two, if you want to know the truth about something, follow the money trail.
The money. So, Curtis, who's the benefit? We only got about a minute here, so real quick answer.
Well, yeah, the globalist corporations that don't really care about America. Look, you've got Silicon Valley, all those tech companies. They bring in people from all over the world to work because they're indentured servants. They're folks that can't change jobs. They work for less than Americans get paid. Disney does the same thing. They've been laying off Americans in the computer department and replacing them with Indians from India, not Navajos I'm talking about. And company after company is doing this. If you're able to, let's say you have a big hospital chain, you want to bring in nurses from the Philippines and pay them less. Under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you'll be able to do that. You won't have to pay Americans anymore. Americans who have mortgages to pay, Americans who need higher wages because they got to send their kids to school, pay the mortgage, and buy a car and pay property taxes.
That's right.
You can replace them with somebody else.
Well, again, let me mention we have a link to AmericanJobsAlliance.com. Some of the other links, we have the 2 articles. And Curtis, this won't be the last time we'll have you on. Actually, we will do it again. But I wanted to educate people, and especially even if they hear a little bit about the Trans-Pacific Partnership at these 2 conventions, the Republican or Democratic convention, to know a little bit more. So thanks for joining us today here on Point of View.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kirby.
We will do it again. Let's take a break. Don't forget, though, we're encouraging you to take action on the Conscience Protection Act. That's available on our website as well. We'll take a break and talk about refugees right after this.
From Sony Pictures Home Entertainment comes Miracles from Heaven, based on the true story about hope, family, and the power of faith. When 10-year-old Anna Beam develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are God's way of letting us know He's here.
And then a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner. Available now on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Rated PG.
The threats to our children and grandchildren today come from many places. Some originate in Washington, D.C. and impact your local schools. Others are hatched overseas. Even major corporations are embracing policies that threaten your family. We can't afford to do nothing. Join the team, Truth Team 360. Enable Point of View to examine what's happening and develop good and wise responses. Together, we can make a difference. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the top right corner. Become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
As I mentioned last hour, we're going to spend some time now talking about the issue of refugees. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this issue, in the last couple of years, about 105,000 refugees have been resettled annually to various developed countries. You have nearly more than 1 million more that have made their way to Europe to seek asylum. And of course, those numbers are just a small fraction of the world's displaced people. How in the world do we think through this? What about the plight? How can the church respond? Are there policies that we need to implement? There are just a lot of questions swirling around this. And so in the next hour, we're going to try to focus on this new book that has been published by Moody Press, Seeking Refuge, about 200 pages on the shores of the Global Refugee Crisis. One of the co-authors is with us by phone, Matthew Soerens. He actually serves as the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. In the past, he's also served as the field director of the Evangelical Immigration Table. He is a graduate of Wheaton College, has a master's degree from DePaul University School of Public Service. And so, Matthew, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, and I think we've talked about various people with World Vision, World Relief, and a variety of other organizations, is that you've had an opportunity to kind of see this and to be informed about that. For just a minute, since I'm familiar with World Relief, but I know maybe some of our listeners are not, can you give us a little bit of a history? Because I think that establishes, if nothing else, your credibility on this issue, but also just a helpful understanding of what has been done in the past.
Sure. So World Relief was actually started back in 1944, and it was actually the folks at Park Street Church in Boston who, in the midst of really the last largest refugee crisis of our time, right after World War II in Europe, they came together and decided to fast and pray and to use some of the funds that they would have otherwise directed towards meals to send over to Europe to support churches helping with the rebuilding process there. So our start as an organization goes back to a refugee crisis, so it's appropriate, I think, that we're continuing to respond. That was called the War Relief Commission at the time, and eventually that became World Relief as we expanded not just to crisis situations, but to addressing poverty and conflict situations around the world. And everywhere where we operate, our mission is to empower the local church to serve the most vulnerable. So we don't necessarily care that someone knows that World Relief is there to help, but we want them to know that the church in their community, whether that's here in the United States or in Jordan or in Germany or in Cambodia, the local church cares about them and about their needs, and does so in a way that is both meeting tangible human needs and is also a witness to who Jesus is as well.
Let me, if I can, then talk about, and this book is just full of really good charts and graphs to help people out, but one of the things that might be helpful for our listeners is to talk about the place where refugees are coming from, and I wouldn't be surprised, I think most people recognize, at least at the moment, more are coming, say, from Syria than anywhere else, but if you add to that Afghanistan and Somalia, now you actually account for almost half of the refugees from just those three countries. If you add in Sudan and South Sudan, you're now getting pretty close to 6 out of 10, and eventually you add a few more, and you've covered quite a bit. So in many cases, we're talking about coming from these Muslim countries, and the reason is, I think, well, and I'll let you go into the details, but of course it's the civil war, it's ISIS, or now called the Islamic State. It's a number of things that have created this refugee crisis, true?
Yeah, there are various different conflicts, unfortunately. So you mentioned several of them. And it is worth noting those are the ones you mentioned, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, are causing the most number of displaced people and the most number of refugees globally. They're not necessarily the number one countries of origin for refugees arriving here in the United States.
Right.
So, for example, the number one country for refugees arriving here last year was Burma, which isn't necessarily on the top 5 list globally. But those situations are, they're distinct. Syria, for example, is a very complex war. The government obviously is one actor there and not a good government by any, real measure. But you have these rebel groups, the worst of which probably is ISIS, but there's other rebel groups as well. And it's a very complex dynamic there. And it's a situation that's been going on now for about 5 years. And really, I think it captured the attention of a lot of Americans, and especially Europeans, just in the last year or so, as many of the people who've been in refugee camps or living in urban areas in Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon started to become very desperate and more started to make a very dangerous journey to Europe. So that's, I think, where it kind of captured the attention of the world. But it's one of many situations. The crisis in Syria is responsible at this point for more refugees globally than any other particular crisis. But refugees are coming from many different countries, and this is a global refugee crisis, not just a Middle Eastern crisis.
You mentioned what happened in the United States, and of course one of the other charts, and I'll kind of jump ahead to that one for a minute since we mentioned it, is that the refugees resettled by World Relief. The number one is Burma, then Iraq, Bhutan, Somalia, some of the countries, by the way, we mentioned in an interview in the first hour, but Burma or Myanmar, depending on how you want to describe it. And that has posed some challenges for you at World Relief, hasn't it?
Well, I think there's some challenges and also some opportunities. In the case of Burma or Myanmar, 70% of the refugees resettled from there have been ethnic minorities who are almost entirely Christian, either Baptist or Anglican or Catholic.
Right.
So it's a unique opportunity to welcome persecuted brothers and sisters, and that's a lot of the people in the community where I live outside of Chicago. I've had neighbors from those backgrounds, and it's a privilege to welcome them. If you look at Iraq, the next country you mentioned, it's also actually a lot of Christian minorities. About 35% of the Iraqi refugees resettled in the last 7 or 8 years have been Christians of some sort or another, but also obviously a Muslim majority. And there, our attitude at World Relief is when there are Christians being resettled, it's an opportunity to stand with the persecuted church. And when there are those who are not yet Christians, we see it as a missional opportunity to make disciples of all nations right in our own communities. And
one of the charts, again, in one of the diagrams you have there, talks about 125,000 Iraqi refugees admitted since 2007. More than a third of them Matthew have spent some time really talking about what we can do for the refugees that are still over there. We've been able to raise a lot of money, I might say, because of the generosity of our listeners, to send that money to the Cradle Fund so that can be put in the hands of pastors in many of those refugee camps, which are filled in some cases with Muslims, Christians, and others, but in large part because of the Islamic State. So that is, again, another factor there as well. We're going to take a break, though, and talk a little bit more after the break about some of the risks, the benefits of this, really understanding this whole idea of refugee settlement. Some of you have asked in the past, and certainly some very important questions, who is chosen and why is it in some countries we see very few Christians that make their way into this country or to other countries? What about the timeline? Now, what does it take for an individual to be resettled? And then, again, as we would certainly want to encourage you to do, find out more about what you can do to help, what your church can do, what you can do as an individual. And I might mention that we have a link to worldrelief.org. That's a link right there next to the picture of Matthew Soerens. And so, again, you can find that on our website, pointofview.net, or go directly to worldrelief.org. Let's take a break talking about this new book, Seeking Refuge on the Shores of the Global Refugee Crisis, published by Moody Press. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Globalization has benefited most everyone on this planet except for the middle class and especially people in the working class. A chart posted by Timothy Carney shows how the global population has fared economically over the last 20 years. I've included the graph with the transcript of this commentary so you can see it for yourself. On the far left are the poorest of the poor who are still as poor as they were. But almost everyone else is doing better economically. This includes the global lower middle class all the way up to the global upper class. But the chart dips down dramatically for one segment that can be identified as the middle class and the working class in wealthy countries like the United States. In the past, the working class and middle class benefited from being born in America. They had access to resources and materials and could exchange in a free market. They also were shielded from competition and industries using workers with lower wages. Globalization opened America's working class to competition from other parts of the global workforce. This chart has appeared in other articles and has often been referred to as the globalization elephant chart. In other words, globalization is often the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. Now, to be fair, many politicians have talked about the fact that the wages of the middle class have declined. Some have suggested trade barriers and all sorts of political and economic solutions. The problem in finding solutions can be seen in the graph that shows how well the wealthy have done. The political and economic elite have benefited greatly from open borders, free trade, and globalization. How motivated do you think they will be to make economic changes that might benefit the working class when it might have a negative impact on their earning potential? When elites in this country and other wealthy countries are getting richer from globalization, I think they won't be very motivated to help the working class. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Available now. Blu-ray, DVD, and digital HD. Rated PG. miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today about refugees, and a little bit later we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. A book I would commend to you, especially if your church is wanting to have an outreach or ministry, is a book just out called Seeking Refuge on the Shores of the Global Refugee Crisis. It is written by Stephen Bauman, who is, of course, the president of World Relief's been on the program with us before. Matthew Soerens, who is with us today and serves as the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. And then also Dr. Issam Shamir, who, interestingly enough, is a clinical psychologist and counselor, individual that actually specializes in trauma treatment for refugees. And while we're talking about that, I know that this would be Dr. Shamir's expertise, but I know, Matthew, you can probably speak to that. Help us understand what these individuals have gone through. Some of these refugees have been through torture. Certainly, they've been through a great deal of geographical displacement. Some of the children have been neglected and abused. What is the status of some of these refugees that even you've had a chance to minister to?
Sure. So by definition, a refugee is someone who's fled persecution, or at least a credible fear of persecution. So, a very significant percentage of them have actually directly been persecuted, and in some cases, tortured. Issam writes in the book about one of the Iraqi refugees who he's served, clinically through our World Relief program here in suburban Chicago. And he's served many people in that context. I think it is really important to understand the impact of trauma on the human brain and how that, what post-traumatic stress disorder can do. It affects, by some estimates, at least about 4 in 10 refugees are, dealing with some effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I also think it's really important to know that there are treatments out there, that, there is healing, and God has made our minds to be very resilient. And we've seen that with, many, many refugees who found healing over some time in many cases through treatment and through prayer and through we've seen people adjust really well despite having gone through some horrific situations. I mean, the young man that Isam describes in the book was as Iraq descended into civil war, not that many years ago, and it was a sectarian sort of thing. So he was basically picked up by by some people who didn't like his religion and tortured and beaten and left to die in a dumpster. And then spent a long time in a hospital recovering because by the grace of God he was found alive by the police. And then eventually he actually went to Syria before Syria had descended into war, and then eventually was, after a lot of screening and processing, was allowed to be resettled to the United States. So he's still dealing with the results of that, but several years in, and he's been here for a little while now, he's actually doing really well. He's actually running a taxi business and employing other refugees as they first arrive. So I don't want that to be too depressing, but it is a reality that I think we have to be aware of as we're serving refugees to know how to serve them effectively.
Let's see if we can maybe talk a little bit about, since you were talking about the fact that you have the opportunity to even welcome persecuted Christians, can you maybe give, especially people in positions of leadership, I'm talking about pastors that listen to this program, Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders, what can the church in America do to stand with the persecuted church? Can you give us some ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot we can do to stand with those who are still out, who are abroad. That's some of what World Relief does, globally in places like Jordan, where we come alongside local churches who are serving many persecuted believers coming out of Syria or Iraq, and those who are displaced internally in Iraq, as well as serving those who are not yet believers. And so it's an opportunity to share the love of Christ beyond the church as well. But there are those opportunities globally, and that's something that World Relief is a priority for us. But I also think sometimes people may not realize how serving refugees who've been resettled to the United States is also an opportunity to stand with the persecuted church. Because if you look at who's been resettled to the U.S. over the last decade at least, more have been of one Christian tradition or another than of people of any other religious tradition. So people, I think maybe with the media focus right now, they tend to hear refugee and think Muslim. And that's actually not necessarily accurate. There are Muslims who come in, but more are Christians than are Muslim.
Right. And you've got a very good chart that helps us understand that. Mostly Christians, some Muslim, some Buddhist, Hindu, and then very small slivers of others. And then since we're talking about that, this is something that I think, again, the book would be very helpful for a lot of our listeners, because we oftentimes are asked, and matter of fact, we've had presidential candidates ask, what's the screening process? Now, you have a chart here and a diagram that talks about 11 steps. Well, I don't want to wear everybody out, but help us understand how first a person is granted refugee status, and then how he or she eventually is provided admission to the United States. It's a pretty detailed process, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very thorough process, and it's the first thing to know is that most refugees are never going to get to make it through that process, because the U.S., for example, last year the U.S. resettled 70,000 refugees nationally, and that might seem like a big number. In some ways it is. It's very generous compared to certain other countries, but it's less than 0.5% of the refugees in the world. So it's not in any way that most refugees are on their way to the United States. It's a very small percentage. But those who are considered, in most cases the process starts with a referral from the United Nations Refugee Agency. But the U.S. government doesn't just take their word for anything. They then begin their own process, and that is led by the U.S. Department of State in coordination with the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security and Defense, the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center, where they individually interview each potential refugee who's being considered for resettlement, both to verify that they indeed meet that legal definition of a refugee, having fled persecution or a credible fear of persecution, and to make sure that they're in no way a public safety threat to the United States. So usually there's multiple interviews. One of the young men I interviewed for the book was interviewed 6 times in the process of just going through the vetting process. There's also background checks, biometric checks, retina scans, and oftentimes interviews with second persons. So, for example, if someone says, my home was bombed in Aleppo on this date, we'll go back and our intelligence services can verify that the story checks out or there's a problem here. So it's a very thorough process. There's also medical screenings involved, because another requirement of the law is that you can't have a public contagious disease. So if someone does have that, it needs to be treated and no longer contagious before someone is allowed onto the airplane. That whole process, it varies a little bit from one country to another, but on average it takes at least 18 months. In some cases it's much longer than that. But it's a pretty thorough process. It's actually the most rigorous process that any category of visitor or immigrant to the United States is required to go through. So I certainly understand when people have questions of, well, how do we know that terrorists aren't coming in to the United States? I don't want terrorists coming into the United States either. But I think if you look at the data, it would only be a very stupid terrorist to actually try to come through the refugee screening process when there's 70 million people who came in as visitors to the U.S. last year. And most of them went through a far less thorough screening than any of the 70,000 who came in as refugees. So I actually have a lot of confidence in that screening process. We've at World Relief been serving refugees who've through the U.S. resettlement program for more than 35 years now. And just as World Relief, we've been responsible for about 275,000 of those folks. And we've consistently found refugees to be people just like most of us who want a better life for their families, who want safety, and who tend to be incredibly grateful to the United States for receiving them.
And again, those are the kind of people we would like to have in this country. The reason I think there's such a concern is that you hear of stories, and of course, again, the ones you've worked with have been from Burma, Iraq, Somalia, Bhutan, places like that. But you hear about these others that we're just going to grab these ones from Syria, but we have no way of really vetting them in the same way that you have been and others have been able to do so. And you can see why there's, of course, that concern. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover this today on the program. So let's take a break. And when we come back, you probably have some questions. We have only covered part of the book, but if you have some comments or questions about the issue of refugees, perhaps your church is already doing something to help welcome refugees, or maybe you wonder a little bit more about some of the issues involved. This was one of the reasons why we wanted to keep Matthew Soerens with us for the entire hour. Again, a U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. And if you'd like to know more about World Relief, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. The action item for us today is one that we mentioned yesterday, but I want to mention it again today. That is, tomorrow in the House of Representatives, there's going to be a vote on the Conscience Protection Act. And this is a particular piece of legislation that would protect the religious right of conscience of individuals. And if you are aware of some of the conversations we've had about the concerns that some pro-life healthcare workers have been forced to participate in abortions, or certainly some of the rulings that have come down from the Department of Health and Human Services, even for our listeners in California, the fact that the state of California has mandated that all employee health care plans cover abortions, even those plans which are available for churches and religious organizations. And if you add to that the decision that was made the other day by the Supreme Court not to hear a case of a Christian-owned pharmacy that did not want to actually prescribe abortion-producing drugs, but are going to be forced by some of those regulations, you can see the importance of a Conscience Protection Act. So you can go to our website, pointofview.net. On the right-hand corner, you will see the section there that says Help Defend Religious Freedom. And just put your name and address down. If you've been there before, it will already surface your member of Congress. If you don't know your member of Congress, it will find that for you. We have a suggested message you could send to them. Click Submit, and you have done your work. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dice of First Liberty is representing Dr. Walsh in his effort to correct this apparent injustice. And Jeremy Dice became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking the truth in love. Click on Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit. Please do it today. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. If you'd like to join our conversation, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Talking about refugees and other displaced people, and talking about some of the risks and benefits, and really some of the key questions that many of you have asked in the past. And that's why, again, this book, Seeking Refuge, which is published by Moody, might be a book that you might be interested in. We have a link to it on our website. Go to pointofview.net. If you click on the picture next to Matthew Soerens, you will see that takes you to worldrelief.org. And then if you click on the picture of the book, you can certainly order it. You probably will find it in your local bookstore, but if not, there's a place for you to get it in paperback or Kindle. And just before we go any further, let me just mention, Matthew, for a minute, that because we have that link to World Relief, can you talk about what people will find when they land on your website? Because some might say, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, or I'd like my church to joint venture with you in a project. Is that possible, and how they go about doing all of this?
Yeah, it absolutely is. In fact, that's the entirety of our mission at World Relief is to empower local churches to serve. So we do that in a few different ways in terms of refugees. One is internationally, where we'll have churches or individuals within the church come alongside World Relief to support and equip churches in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world who are serving refugees and other displaced people. So there's info on that, and we call that Unlock Hope. You see that on our website. But there's also in the U.S., and we have offices in about 27 locations around the U.S., so we're unfortunately not everywhere, but we're in a good number of communities throughout the country where we are resettling refugees. We're one of 9 agencies nationally that is authorized by the State Department to facilitate that resettlement and integration process, and the only distinctly evangelical organization of those 9. So our goal with each refugee that arrives is to have them be welcomed by what we call a good neighbor team, and that's basically a small group from a local church who will commit to basically walking alongside that family for the first 6 months to 12 months that they're in the country. We actually hope that that beyond that it becomes just a reciprocal friendship that continues on, perhaps right on into eternity. But most of the real needs that people have are in those first several months that they're adjusting to their new life. And of course, World Relief staff are there to help with that as well. But a team from a church is able to just go deeper relationally than our staff might be able to, who have many cases to manage. So that's something people can find out about at worldrelief.org or the links there on your website. We also have, there are needs, things like we'll put together what we call a welcome kit. So as a family's arriving, maybe some people may say, well, I don't really have a lot of time to give, but I'd like to help with some of the items that family is going to need as they settle into their new apartment. So that's another way that churches have been involved. And even churches beyond, the close proximity to where we're resettling refugees might be able to ship a container of some of the things that a refugee family is going to need as they get started.
Again, sometimes churches, if they have enough refugees in an area, of course, I think we're all familiar with, of course, Spanish churches and Asian churches and churches that have Cambodian services. And I'm familiar with one that's not too far from where I'm broadcasting today that have a number of people from Nepal. So it's Nepalese, so there are those opportunities as well. And if a church finds itself saying, I just need a little more help, or somebody that's had a little more expertise with this, I would certainly encourage them to contact you there at World Relief.
Yeah, and that's one of the most exciting things we've seen is really churches growing in the heart languages of these refugees. So where I live, we've got multiple Nepali churches now. We have several different churches with different languages from Burma. We have an Arabic-speaking church. We have a Sudanese church. There's a Liberian Christian fellowship. So there's groups of believers from many different countries. Many of them were believers when they got here, but we also have seen many come to Christ after arriving in this country, coming from other religious traditions. But as they've been welcomed by local churches, they want to join the church themselves, which is really, an amazing thing to witness.
Let's, if we can, get into some of the questions you're asking. So, again, I wouldn't ask these if it weren't something that you address as well. One of those is, aren't they a drain on our already struggling economy? You've heard that before, and you've devoted a few pages to that in the book. How do you respond?
Yeah, I think that's a big concern and an understandable concern for a lot of Americans. We want to be compassionate, but can we afford to be? But the interesting thing is, if you poll Americans, a lot are concerned about the economic impacts of refugees or of immigration more broadly. If you poll economists, the people who study this, they almost universally think that the net economic impact of immigrants, and that would include refugees, although it's a larger group of people as well, is very positive for the U.S. economy. And there's a number of reasons for that, one of which is that those refugees are also consumers. So they come in and they're buying things in our community. They're buying food and paying rent and buying iPhones and, paying car payments and all those other things that feed back into the growth of the overall economy. They're also contributing in terms as taxpayers. They're contributing as entrepreneurs in many cases. I think one of the we mentioned in the book a study out of Columbus, Ohio, that found that refugees are actually about twice as likely as native-born U.S. citizens to start small businesses. And you never quite know when those small businesses might become big business. Most people are familiar with Google, but they may not know the story behind it. It was actually started, or co-founded at least, by a guy named Sergey Brin, who came to the United States as a refugee from the former Soviet Union, who was persecuted because of his Jewish identity. And the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, one of the other resettlement agencies, helped him and helped his family resettle in the United States. And he went on to found a company that I think by one measure is now the most valuable company in the world, and one that most of us use a few times a day at least. So you never know. Sometimes people say, well, how many jobs are those people going to take? And we forget to ask sometimes how many jobs they might create, especially if you can look at this over the long term. And there have been studies that while refugees do, there are some costs up front, although it's also important to know, like, refugees pay for their own airplane ticket. They get a loan, but they have to pay that back at zero interest over time. And they're expected to be working very quickly after they arrive and to become economically self-sufficient. But still, there are some costs up front, but within a few years, they're actually contributing more in taxes than anything that they're receiving on the average. And so over the longer term, they're not just an economic benefit in terms of their purchasing power, but also a fiscal benefit to the country.
What would you suggest about refugees overseas? One of the things we've wanted to do as we raise money for the Cradle Fund, because we talked with Johnny Moore and we want to do some more of those kinds of things, is recognize we have a number of Christians that fled Iraq and other places, are in refugee camps. They really aren't necessarily planning to come to the United States because their hope is someday we could defeat the Islamic State and they could go back to their homeland. This may be the first time really since the early first centuries after Christ where we don't have Christians in some of these areas of the Middle East. And so there is a way in which certainly we could support those who are coming here for resettlement, but there also are ways, can't we, to support those that find themselves in refugee camps with the hope of going back to their homes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, sometimes we get asked the question, well, should we be helping Middle Eastern Christians to leave or helping them to stay? And that's a complicated question. I think most would like to stay, and we would like most to be able to stay. Now, if somebody makes a decision that their life is at risk and they need to leave, it's not our job to second-guess that. It's our job, I think, biblically to welcome them and to care for them as we would want to be welcomed if we were forced to flee. But I think we should do all we can to make, to support the conditions where they would be able to stay in safety. And so there's ways to do that, in terms of financial contributions. There's ways to do that in terms of advocating for public policies. I think prayer is, we forget the importance of prayer, especially in a situation like what's gone on in Iraq, what's going on in Syria, which is so much bigger than, I don't have a silver bullet policy solution to hand you and say, here's what we need to do, and it will solve everything. It's complicated. But I do know that it's not too big for God, and to be faithful in prayer that those situations could be resolved peacefully and in ways that would allow the church to continue to exist in places where there has been a Christian presence since basically the days of Jesus himself. One of the ways that my co-author Isam has been involved. He's actually from Jordan originally, and he's a Christian who grew up in Jordan. But he's gone back to the Middle East, both to Jordan and to Lebanon, to Turkey, to various other countries on a number of occasions. And he's actually been able to work with Syrian Christian leaders, in this case Jesuit leaders from the Catholic Church, who could make it out of Syria, and he's been able to provide training on trauma counseling, because there's a lot of people who want to stay, but one of the most practical ways that the churches there can help them is by helping them work through the trauma that they've experienced. And unfortunately, that's an incredibly high percentage of the Syrian people, including especially many Christians at this point. So that's been a neat way that he's been able to be a part of coming alongside the local church there in Syria, and facilitating the possibility of them staying. World Relief has done similar things in Iraq, with developing what we call child-friendly spaces, which is basically just a place for kids who have been internally displaced in Iraq, and many of them are Christian. Others are other religious minorities, like the Yazidi people, who are also very persecuted. Providing a safe place for them to have some educational content, to work through some of the trauma issues, and just to be safe. Because sadly, there's a whole generation of children who are not in school, who've been displaced, and their lives are just passing on year by year.
Yes.
And there's incredible risk there, actually. Sometimes people ask, well, can we afford to respond to this refugee crisis? And we might want to ask, can we afford not to?
Yes.
Because the long-term ramifications of children growing up marginalized without education could actually be much more serious even than what we're seeing now.
Let's take a break. We'll come back. And what about asylum seekers and some other issues of persecution? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take some phone calls along the way. Matthew Soerens with us as we talk about a book that he has co-authored, and it is entitled Seeking Refuge. And we'll go to some phone calls here. Let's go to Georgia first on the Good News Network. Heather, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Matthew Soerens.
Yes, hello. I wanted to ask about the people arriving. I think it's for asylum. Lewiston, Maine has had quite an influx of asylum seekers, and they have they're not allowed to work because they're asylum seekers instead of refugees.
Right. And you've got a whole section in your book about asylum seekers, and I was going to ask you the question, but Heather asked it, so how would you respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. So asylum is basically someone who does not come through the refugee resettlement program, but comes in some other way, usually on a tourist visa or without a visa. And at the point that they're in, at the U.S. federal government, they basically say, I have a credible fear of persecution because of my race, my religion, political opinion, national origin, social group, that definition of a refugee. And then the U.S. government basically begins a process of determining, through a series of interviews and investigations, if if our government believes that you indeed meet that definition. If you do, you'll be granted asylum in most cases and be allowed to stay. If you don't, in most cases, you'd be deported. So the trick with that is that process takes time, and it can take several months. In some cases, it can take multiple years. And while it's pending, in most cases, those individuals are not authorized to work. So unless you happen to, if you're on a temporary work visa, you might be allowed to work. But in most cases, it's a tourist visa or a student visa or some other visa that doesn't necessarily have work privileges. So that means you can't work and take care of yourself. You're also not eligible for welfare or food stamps or any sort of public benefits that might allow you to, at least cover your basic expenses. So asylum seekers can be really uniquely vulnerable, actually. Now, in some cases, they come with more resources, and that was why they were able to get a tourist visa in the first place. So maybe they can cover their own way for, several months without working. But even people who came from a upper middle class background, those funds are going to run out pretty quickly. So we actually think it's a very unique opportunity for the church to fill in a gap that, I understand why our government takes that position, because there can be, false asylum claims as well, and they don't want to be subsidizing someone who might be committing fraud. But there's also many legitimate claims, and again, that includes a number of persecuted Christians who are very vulnerable during that interim period. Not only that, but in some cases they end up in a detention center, in basically a jail-like facility where they're held if there's some concern that they might, not show up for their immigration court date. And those people are even more vulnerable. One of the cool ministries World Relief is a part of in Seattle is we help local churches go in and do church services in one of those immigrant detention centers. We have multiple services every Sunday and had hundreds of people baptized last year. So we are doing our best to help those people, both spiritually and with their practical needs, with legal services in some of our offices. But it's a huge area of need and a place where I'd love to see the church more involved.
Very good. Heather, appreciate your phone call. Thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that in a case like Lewiston, Maine, they've had quite an influx of Muslims up there because they didn't want their people involved in inner city, the way that, our inner cities, well, not just inner cities, conduct their youth. And they found Lewiston, Maine to be more likable to their culture. And so they have a lot of people up there that the locals, they don't get any money from state or federal for asylum seekers, and they're having to support these people.
Yeah, it is. In some ways, it's a gap it's a challenging dynamic, and there's not an easy answer to it, but, I think it is an opportunity for the church. And it makes, you're all right, it's true of refugees as well. A lot of them would love to live in a big city, but a lot would be much more comfortable in a smaller city or in a more rural context. And we've seen, actually, the Somali community is particularly large there in Lewiston. There's been refugees resettled there, and World Relief we're not active there, but it's other resettlement agencies. But I think that's part of, once there's an established community, that's often where others will want to go, is where they have someone else who speaks their language and can help them adjust to the culture.
Yeah, well, and this is a place where I wish you were there, because I could say, well, maybe we could funnel resources through you, because it's not fair for just the people in that community to have to support that influx of people. The church, the body of Christ worldwide could be getting and providing some of that. But we're just about out of time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity, Matthew, to maybe close by talking again about how individuals or individual churches could be involved with you at World Relief. So can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what they can find when they land on your website?
Yeah, well, our real hope is that in the midst of a horrific refugee crisis, and we don't pretend to know why God allows all the persecution that does exist, but I do believe that he has a purpose even and can work redemptively even in the midst of what man intended for evil. We see that biblically in the story of Joseph, and we really think that that's the opportunity that the church has right now globally to respond to the refugee crisis, to be the shining city on a hill that Jesus tells his followers to be in Matthew chapter 5. And there are millions of displaced people in the world, and many others out who aren't persecuted, but are just watching how the church will respond to this. And if we respond with the love of Christ, we really believe it is an opportunity to point people to Him. So there's practical ways to do that. You can find some of them on our website. There's lots of opportunities, especially in the communities where we are resettling refugees, to volunteer, to help build teams that will come alongside local families. There's needs like legal services and English instruction and all sorts of ways that churches can be involved. And I would also just challenge, especially pastors or leaders, we need to talk about this issue from a biblical perspective and not just as a political or economic issue. And there's a lot there biblically to focus as a discipleship opportunity.
Well, again, Matthew, appreciate you being with us, and say hello to your co-authors, and thank you for being a part of the book, Seeking Refuge. Thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby.
Let's take a break. And just before we run out of time, one of the action items that we've been talking about over the last 2 hours is the Conscience Protection Act, a vote taking place tomorrow. And again, the need, I think, is illustrated by looking at a couple of events that have taken place. First of all, the Department of Health and Human Services under the Obama administration has refused to uphold what we call the federal law known as the Weldon Amendment, and that bars federal funds from being used by the federal government or even states to discriminate against health care providers who do not provide abortion coverage. That should be straightforward, but you can see that that is not taking place, and there is certainly a real concern about that nationally. Then the California example is even a better one, and that is the California Department of Managed Health Care has issued a directive requiring all insurance plans under the state's authority to cover abortions. And this means churches, it means religious charities, nonprofits, all sorts of others that would never have wanted to provide for abortions in their health care plan. And so this is one of the reasons why, and there are many others. I use the example of the Christian-owned pharmacy in Washington, which brought a case all the way to the Supreme Court, which they chose not to hear, which would require them to actually dispense abortion-causing drugs. And so this is why we think it is really important to get behind this Conscience Protection Act. As you go to the website, pointofview.net, you'll see a button there that says Help Defend Religious Freedom. As you click on that, we give you a little more information about the Department of Health and Human Services, what's been happening there, a little bit about what's happened in the state of California, and then really encourage you to contact your member of Congress and ask him or her to support the Conscience Protection Act. We have information about it. We have a suggested message, which starts out as one of your constituents. We ask you to actively support the Conscience Protection Act, which is introduced by Representative John Fleming, and encourage you to make any modifications in that message you might want to do, and then click the send button, and then to send it off to Congress. They're voting on it tomorrow. We wanted to give you a chance to react to that, and please take the time to do so. Also want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Modern life is go, 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 and Point of View is absolutely ready to go with you. I dare say that most of us have access to either a smartphone or a tablet, maybe even a computer that is app-based. There's a new way to keep up with Kirby and the team, the free Point of View radio app. With quick links to listen to the program live, to keep up and share Kirby's meaty and insightful viewpoints, commentaries, read articles on issues we're talking about that impact you and your family. Did you know you can also watch the show? Yes, radio with cameras. You can access that through the app as well. There's a link to our action alerts, how to find us on the radio across the nation, ways to contact us, and so much more. Visit your app store, iTunes or Google Play. Search for the Point of View radio app. There's no reason not to take us with you. The free Point of View radio app, available now for Apple and Android devices. And when you get it loaded, there's one more button I'd like you to press, the one that says Donate Now. Join Truth Team 360. Support us financially as we support you with the truth that you need. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.